حرقت مضافتي، ابن يوسف حرقوا له داره، ابن وسام ناهبين البيت بكامله بس مش ماخذين شيء، بس التخريب كامل. مضافتي انحرقت أنا جاري مناسبي، جاري صيح جبل حارقين الدار كلها. أنا شيعته بيديتي أنا من جبل هيكل عظمي فقط، ما في لا لحم ولا شحم ولا شيء.
اجت القذيفة هون حدينا بالضبط، وتضررت الحارة كلها والبيت أكثر شيء هون متضرر. كل شيء مكسور، كل الأبواب تخلعت، كل الشبابيك تخلعت كمان، ما ضل شيء.
تمام. تعرضتوا لإهانات لفظية؟
كل البيت يعني سبونا وكانوا طول الوقت هن عم يصيحوا علينا.
المشهد بيحكي عن الواقع من دون ما نحكي عنه أي شيء، بس يقال إنه عشائر ويقال أهل السويداء. طيب معنا نحن مع الحكي هذا، طالما إنه العشائر وأهل السويداء، وين الدولة صار لها 10 أيام؟ وينها؟ لنيجي نحكي إنه الدولة بدها تفض، وين بدها تفض؟ نحن 10 أيام ما في بيت فيه المواد الأولية، سواء كان الخدمات ولا طبية ولا حتى إعاشي. وينهم؟ بعد 10 أيام، بعد 20 يوم ما تموت الناس وتتقتل بنقول إنه في دولة؟ هذا المشهد لحاله بيحكي.
Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Kevork Almassian, the host of the very popular Syriana Analysis program. So welcome. It's good to have you on.
It's a really pleasure to be on your show. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I wanted to speak with you about Syria because, well, you've been covering this topic since forever, and for years, you warned that the United States and its allies were supporting terror groups in the efforts to topple Assad. As you know, this was sold to the public as supporting moderate rebels, in which the US cooperated with Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, allegedly to support democracy and promote human rights. Now, this succeeded, and as you predicted, we now have a former ISIS under the leadership of Jolani in power of Syria. Now, it's very hard, unlike in the past, to dismiss this as propaganda, given that he was on the US terror list himself with a bounty on his head. But nonetheless, it's being now whitewashed, and he cut his hair and he wears a suit, so now he's moderate. But how can we understand how we got to this point and what is actually happening in Syria now?
Actually, in order to understand the Syrian conflict, we have to put it in a proper context, and that is why Syria was targeted. Was Syria targeted because of the lack of democracy? Was the lack of freedom of expression? No. Of course, Syria was not a Switzerland, and to be very frank, there was a political authoritarianism, which means you have the social freedoms, or you used to have the social freedoms in Syria, you used to have the religious freedoms in Syria, and you can practice your religious and cultural affairs in all the way possible, as long as you're not intervening in other people's affairs. Now, the problem with Syria was that as long as you don't come after the head of the state and you don't pose a serious, let's say, security or political threat against the head of the regime, then nothing is going to happen to you. On the other hand, the alternatives, which were the Nusra Front, ISIS, let's say Ahrar al-Sham and the others, they were promising an Islamic state in the country, which means they were not going to bring democracy. And even worse, they were going to bring an Islamic theocracy to the country, which is, in my opinion, worse than a political authoritarianism. Now, why the Americans, the Brits, especially the CIA, the MI6 and the MIT jumped the wagon of the regime change? Because of the geopolitical posture of Syria in the region, especially after the invasion of Iraq, when Colin Powell came to Syria, he presented a list of demands from Bashar al-Assad, telling him that he has to reorient Syria's geopolitical posture from being a member in what used to be called the axis of resistance into the moderate Arab camp, which means Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and other countries who normalize ties with Israel, whether tacitly or over the table. Now, after these incidents, Syria, the United States imposed sanctions on Syria, was under George W. Bush. And President Bashar back then, he accelerated the support to the non-state actors in the region who were fighting against the US and Israeli hegemony, one of which was Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and some of the groups in Iraq. So this was when the president of Syria back then crossed the red line, according to the American decision makers or the planners there, and they wanted to topple him. Now, the French back then, they persuaded the Americans, telling them that we have to give Bashar another chance. They invited him to Paris in 2008. This was during the French National Day. And they have given him the red carpet treatment. They have treated him like he is a world leader. They put him on a podium alongside all the world leaders, including Ban Ki-moon, the foreign ministers, the presidents, the prime ministers, all around the world. They were gathering there, including the prime minister of Israel back then. And this was the moment when the French have set a trap for Bashar on the podium, that they wanted to push him to shake hands back then with the prime minister of Israel. If you go back to the archives and watch this video and how Ban Ki-moon was talking to Bashar, the Emir Hamad bin Jassim was talking to Bashar, and many others were physically pushing him to shake hands with Olmert back then, and he rejected that. And this was the moment when they decided that it is not possible to persuade Assad to become friends with Israel and eventually friends with the moderate Arab camp. And this was the same year when the former French foreign minister, he confessed on France 24, saying that he was contacted in 2008 after these incidents by his British counterparts, telling him that if he wants to participate in a regime change operation that is going to start in Syria soon. And 2 years later, the Arab Spring started, and 1 year later, the Arab Spring has moved into Syria. So this was the main consideration why they wanted to destabilize Syria, to bring, let's say, a puppet government which can normalize ties with Israel. But Israel had a different strategy in mind. For Israel, it is not enough to have a neighbor country like Syria, which has a centralized government and normalizing ties with Israel. For Israel, they wanted to fragment Syria as well, to balkanize the country. And that is why the Israelis and the deep state in the United States, they have supported these radical Takfiri elements in the country, because they know once this type of elements come to power, they will destroy the centralized government completely. They will destroy the state institutions. And after that, they will come after the social structures, the social components in the country. So they would destroy the nation state, and they would also destroy the social contract in the country, which was built on coexistence between 20 different sects and ethnicities. And this is exactly what happened now. Once Jolani came to power, the state institutions were completely destroyed. Israel intervened and destroyed the Syrian army completely, wiped it out, especially the strategic weapons. And then Jolani went after the minorities, like the Alawites first, the Shiites, and now he's coming after the Druze community. So this is all going according to the plan. It's a civil war already, and they want to prolong it as long as they can to create mini states in the country. Before the regime change, people used to identify themselves as Syrian. I'm a Syrian of Armenian ethnicity. I'm a Syrian, but my religion is Muslim, and my sect is, for example, Alawite or Shia or Sunni. Now, because of this sectarian and ethnic motivated war conducted and waged by the Jolani regime against the social components of Syria, everybody started seeing itself as part of their macro identity. They now identify as an Alawite, as a Shia, as a Sunni, as a Kurd, and no longer a Syrian. And this was the purpose of this regime change war. As I mentioned, one of the factors of it, to destroy the national identity of Syria and to create cantons in the country, which every component now relies on foreign power to protect itself. Now, Jolani sends his Al-Qaeda army and the Bedouins against the Druze, and the Druze find themselves isolated, so they call the protection of Israel. So this desperation that they have created due to the psychological operations and the security operations against them has forced many components of the Syrian society to rely on outside powers, and therefore there is no longer Syrian people, there is no longer Syrian state, it's completely collapsed. And what we're seeing now is only the fragmentation, the continuation of the fragmentation of the Syrian state in order for Israel to move and expand further into Syrian territories, to create or expand its sovereignty into the places which they say are part of the greater Israel project. And I suspect that they will start by opening a corridor between the Golan Heights all the way to Asweda, where the conflict is ongoing at the current moment. And from Asweda, they go east to the Al-Tanf border crossing, where the American occupation forces are stationed there. And that was the main reason why they were stationed there in the past 10 years. And from there, they would open a land route to the eastern shore of the Euphrates, where the Kurdish forces are stationed and supported by the United States, by the way. And if they reach to the eastern shore of the Euphrates, means Israel would have a geopolitical connectivity between the Golan Heights and eastern shore of the Euphrates. And from the eastern shore of the Euphrates, they can project their dominance on southwest of Iraq, especially in the Anbar region and the Shia neighborhoods, where they are mostly pro-Iran. So this is coming like step by step on the chessboard after Iran. And I suspect that the next operation, the destabilization operation, is going to be in Iraq and Egypt, of course, later against Iran. So they're trying to encircle Iran from all sides through this David Corridor one, and in the Southern Caucasus through this Zangesor Corridor, which is now going to be opened. And the United States is going to lease 30 kilometers deep inside Armenian territories. And that means the Americans and the Israelis are on the borders with Iran in the northern part. And through the David corridors, they can project their hegemony again on Iran. This is going to be very bad news for Iran.
There's a lot there I want to unpack, but to begin with the first one, this desire to dismantle Syria. I don't think it's a great secret that Israel prefers weak or more chaotic neighbors, something that can't mount an effective opposition to it. But this desire to break up Syria in small pieces, establish a sphere influence, it seems Israel might actually annex some of more of its territories. Does this harmonize fully, though, with the ambitions of the Americans and the Turks? Because they well, one gets the impression from Erdogan, he's not willing to oppose Israel strongly on anything. Rhetorically, yes, but not beyond that. But certainly Turkey has an interest in a more integrated Syria under Turkish, not control, well, yeah, you can say control or influence. But the United States, where are their interests? Or are they just going to follow Israel where Israel leads them?
Actually, I believe Turkey prefers a centralized government in Syria, controlled by Jolani. But the idea of the centralized government is, in the mind of Turkey and Jolani, is not based on state institutions, on the citizenship, that everyone is equal in front of the constitution. No, it is based on the subjugation of the other components of the Syrian society. And this is the same mentality that used to prevail under the Ottoman Empire when they created a big empire, but they have subjugated many of their people who used to live under the Ottoman Empire, one of which were my grandparents, the Armenians, the Greeks, the Alawites, right? Therefore, the idea of Jolani building a nation state or a centralized government is a grotesque idea, in my opinion. It cannot function as long as Jolani is in power. So if Turkey is interested in building a nation state in Syria, which can extend its sovereignty on the entirety of the Syrian geography, they cannot use Jolani for this purpose. They need someone else because Jolani comes with a different mentality. Jolani comes from a jihadi background, and he has a sectarian and ethnic prejudice against the components of the Syrian society, one of which are the Christians. So one example is when the terrorist attack happened in San Elias Church in Damascus a few weeks ago. Jolani didn't call it a terrorist attack. Jolani didn't even mourn the nation. He didn't even call 3 days of mourning. And the people who committed this terrorist attack were part of the general security of Jolani itself. And if he condemns this act as a terrorist act, he will condemn himself, one, because the people who committed it are part of his general security, and second, he himself committed such crimes in the past, right? So there is a contradiction between pushing for a centralized state and bringing someone like Jolani in power. Now, Israel, on the other hand, the Americans, it seems that they were persuaded by the Saudis and by the Turks that they can control Syria through proxy, which means the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they would share the cake and they would manage the affairs of Syria. They want a centralized government. And some of the officials in the United States, they bought that illusion. Now, Israel had a different say because Israel has the Greater Israel Project in the region, and they want to extend their territorial claims inside Syrian territories, which means they need to ignite such civil war, such sectarian tensions in the country in order to present themselves as savior. And one of the examples of it is what happened now in Sweden. The Jolani was in Baku, and he met, reportedly, according to Israeli reports, with senior security officials from Israel. And once he landed in Damascus, he unleashed this attack against the Druze community in Sweden. Now, the PR machine of Jolani, they, especially the British side, they came all saying that, oh, there was a misunderstanding. Jolani misunderstood Israel, and he thought that there is a green light from Israel and the United States to bring Sweden back under its patronage. Now, if this is correct, if this theory correct, then they used him as the Saddam Hussein 2.0. Because remember, when Saddam attacked Kuwait, he sent a letter back then to the American ambassador and trying to test the waters to see if the Americans would mind if he invades Kuwait. And he didn't receive an objection from the Americans. They didn't tell him yes, they didn't tell him no. He thought there was a green light and he attacked Kuwait. And what happened after that? They destroyed his army on the way when he was withdrawing from Kuwait, and then imposed draconian sanctions on him. So if this theory is correct, then they have used him as a sacrifice cow, just like they did with Saddam Hussein in the 90s. But I don't believe in this theory. I believe that Jolani has been selected for the purpose of starting this type of sectarian civil war in the country in order to create vertical lines in the Syrian society. And he successfully managed now to create these vertical lines. Once this attack happened against Sweden, the people in Sweden, they no longer see themselves as part of the Syrian state and the Syrian nation any longer. They don't want to be part of it. And the rest of the communities, for example, the Alawites, they see the same thing, but the Alawites do not have arms and they don't have any regional power in their back. But now if you come to Syria as a regional power or an international superpower and say, I am the protector of the minorities in Syria, every single minority in the country, including the Sunni secularists, will come and say, I don't want to be under the Jolani regime. I would be better off and protected by any of these regional powers, which means the meal is already ready. It's being cooked. It's being cooked for over 14 years, and the meal is already ready. And the amount of desperation they have spread among the Syrian people by the sanctions, by the devastating impact of the wars, by the trauma, and now by the sectarian civil war waged by the Jolani regime. Even if the other day I said, whoever comes and presents itself as a savior of the people, they will accept it. They will accept the evil, they will accept the shaitan, they will accept anyone if this power can save them. So this is the overall situation in Syria, which means that the Syrian, it's not only the Syrian nation which has collapsed, it's the Syrian soul. And the Syrian soul, which I know from Syria because I lived most of my life there, is this social contract between us and all the other people in the country. That is, I respect you, you respect me, I mind my own business, I follow my own rituals, you follow your own rituals, but this has all gone at the current moment, and there is no longer peace and coexistence among the Syrian people.
Something quite remarkable, if not impressive, by the ability to sell the incursion or the division of Syria as a humanitarian goal. But again, why mess with a recipe that is applied to every single conflict, it seems, but this time with Israel committing a genocide on one side of the border, and on the other side of the border they're now the humanitarian protector from the government which they helped to bring into power. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, but it does appear that much of the media is following the narrative which is being handed to them. I was curious though, because you referred to Iran, that they could be encircled. You said this would be very bad news for Iran, and there does appear to be a general goal of reshuffling or having a geopolitical reorganization of the entire region. And they also mentioned Azerbaijan. What forces do you see in place here? Obviously, the U.S. And Israel are not done yet with Iran, but it seems as if they would have preferred to fight Iran through a proxy, which is why I thought selling weapons to Giuliani and the new authorities in Syria could be one step towards this goal. And many people also now look towards Azerbaijan's increasing leaning towards Israel. Again, this is not a new thing, but how would Iraq play into this? Because, now they always said that Iraq was the pathway to Iran. At least that's what was said 22 years ago with the invasion of Iraq. How do you see, I guess, the wider shakeup of the region?
Before the Islamic Revolution under Shah saw the pan-Turkic countries as more of a threat to the national security of Iran. Now, when the Islamic Revolution happened, they have shifted this narrative into it's Israel who is the existential threat against the Islamic Revolution and Islamic world, etc. in the region. I'm not disputing the fact that both Israel and Turkey and the other pan-Turkic countries are some sort of a threat. But now, after the regime change in Syria, I believe that Turkey has extended its influence not only to the Levant, but also in the Caucasus, because now they have Pashinyan in Armenia, who is perfectly willing to play balls with both Aliyev and Erdogan in this case, for the sake of reorienting Armenia from the CSTO pro-Iran, let's say, camp into the pro-Atlantic camp. Right? And therefore, Iran will soon find itself encircled from the north by Azerbaijan, Armenia, the United States transatlantic camp, basically. And they will find themselves that Turkey is perfectly capable of projecting its pan-Turkic hegemony or neo-Ottoman aspiration to Central Asia through this corridor, which is called Nakhichevan now. And this will destabilize some of the Central Asian countries as well. They will increase their influence over the region, and Iran sooner or later will find itself that the Turkish threat against them is of a greater extent than the Israeli one. That's probably why they are now sending signals to the United States that they're willing to continue the negotiations with the Americans, the nuclear program, in order to avoid such clashes and confrontation. But that will not work with the Iranians, because Iran has built its entire strategy in the region in the past 40 years of driving the American dominance out of the region. Now, backtracking now means that Islamic Revolution is over. If the Islamic Revolution over in Iran, that means there is no longer a need for the Ayatollah Khamenei and the entire regime that is based on the concept of fighting against the American and Israeli hegemony in the region. So what has been done basically after October 7, the Israelis came after every player in the axis of resistance and knock them out or localize them and cut these axes by accelerating and restarting the regime change operation. Meanwhile, Iran preferred to lead the axis from the back. They didn't want to come to the front line and fight the fight for themselves unless they were seriously hit by the Israelis. But I can assure you, according to information, very reliable one, that the Iranians came to Damascus. This was in June 2024, and they asked Assad back then to allow them to open a new front line through proxies or through allies against the Golan Heights, against the Israeli forces there. And Assad asked him the following question: if Israel retaliates in a harsh way on Damascus, and they're going to carpet bomb us like they do in the Dahiya, the southern suburbs of Beirut or Gaza, will you intervene? Will Iran come in protection to protect its allies? And the answer was passive. So Syria rejected to open a new front line against the Golan Heights. In my opinion, if you are the leader of the Axis, you have to play a more active role in this axis, just like the Americans came and protected Israel in this case, in every way possible, militarily, logistically, intelligence level, etc. But the Iranians preferred to lead it from the back, and they call this the strategic patience. But the strategic patience has become a liability now for Iran. And they are in a very bad geopolitical shape at the current moment, that even though they are showing signals that they want to negotiate with the Americans, but the Americans and the Israelis see the weakness of Iran at the current moment on this geopolitical chessboard in the region, and they know that the Iranians prefer to preserve their national security and territorial integrity. That's why they will come further. They will push more and more and more and come closer and closer and closer, because this is how the Americans and the Israelis negotiate. You give them an inch, they want to come and take more and more and more. And in this case, I believe that Azerbaijan is going to play a central role, which, remember, during the 2020 and 2023 conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, Iran sided with Azerbaijan. Iran said that Azerbaijan has a claim over Nagorno-Karabakh, and they supported it. But they have shot themselves in the leg. And I asked a few Iranian officials back then, I said, what are you doing? You are allowing Azerbaijan to come closer to your borders, and Azerbaijan is an advanced satellite state for Israel. According to WikiLeaks documents, the Mossad operatives say, I'm quoting them, that they feel home in Baku. There are no restrictions for them. And what are the Mossad operatives doing in Baku, basically? They are destabilizing Iran, right? And now that Azerbaijan occupied Nagorno-Karabakh, they have established 3 air bases there. To who are these bases directed at? At Iran. And on the borders between Iran and Azerbaijan, now Israelis have built what is called smart villages. And this is very interesting story, that the Israelis are building smart villages. Nobody knows what's the nature of this smart village, but the helicopter of Raisi fell 200 kilometers away from one of these smart villages. So this raises serious questions about the utility and the purpose of Israel building these smart villages on the borders there. And if we listen to the claims of some Iranian reports, some of the drones attacked against Iran came from Azerbaijan. So in this case, I see that Iran's passive, let's say, posture that they want to lead from the back has backfired against them. And now they see themselves in a situation that they want to preserve their national security and territorial integrity. But rest assured that the Israelis and the Americans aren't done yet with them. As much as the Iranians will give compromises, they will come after them, because they know that Iran has lost its leverage, especially the allies who were perfectly capable of establishing front-line deterrence against Israel, for example, Hezbollah, that if you attack Iran, we have friends and allies on your borders perfectly capable of destroying some of your settlements. But remember, in the last attack against Iran, Hezbollah didn't intervene. because Hezbollah has been localized, because Hezbollah knows at the current moment that its existence and the existence of its people, the Shia community, is in jeopardy, is in great threat. So they prefer to preserve themselves locally inside Lebanon, also expecting an attack from Syria. Now on their borders, you have all these jihadists and these so-called Bedouins, many of whom were ISIS, and now they are called Bedouins. Why this experiment of normalizing this jihadi scene in Syria, it will be copied and they will unleash these Bedouins and these ISIS hordes soon. If Hezbollah doesn't disarm, Tom Barak continues saying Hezbollah has to disarm itself. It's a crazy idea. It's like you have to disarm yourself waiting for the knife to come to your neck. No, they will not disarm themselves, and they will fight when the time comes. But I believe that the next target, if the Americans cannot disarm Hezbollah through diplomatic means, they will use these proxies in Syria to add pressure on Lebanon as well in order to force Hezbollah to disarm. But my opinion is Hezbollah is well trained and too competent for these chaotic Bedouins and ISIS hordes to be able to eliminate Hezbollah as an organization.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, yeah, many people have been expecting that as Syria fell, that the new terrorist proxies now running Syria, that they would likely be used to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. But I find Turkey to be very interesting in all of this, because they are playing a big game. And as you said, when Turkey can connect properly with Azerbaijan, they'll have a nice northern flank against the Iranians, but also have strong access into Central Asia. And well, for me, the strangest piece in this puzzle is the country in between, though, Armenia. To me, this makes no sense at all. It just seems as if Pashinyan making one self-destructive decision after another, strengthening his adversaries, weakening his partners. I can't make sense of it. It's a very strange thing to partner up with the two wolves on each side, Turkey and Azerbaijan, who should be considered their main adversaries. Anyways, because it doesn't make any sense, it also suggests that it might not be very stable, these ambitions. And this seems to be a common theme with Turkey, though. That is, especially under Erdogan, they always have great ambitions, always very deceptive in how they pursue these ambitions. But there's also a tendency by Turkey to overplay its hand. That's why I want to ask you, what do you make sense of what could happen, not just in this narrow region, but if you widen it out, because you have big actors such as, well, obviously Russia is not happy to see what is going on in the Caucasus, with especially what Azerbaijan is doing these days. But you also have countries like China, who is not gonna let Iran fall. So what do you see in this dynamic? What are you reading into it?
First of all, I want to comment on Pashinyan. You said it doesn't make sense, and you're the expert.
Sorry if I can interject. Based on national interest, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't make any sense. And you're the expert on this. And when it doesn't make any sense, and when you see the national interest of Armenia, and you see that they are just walking opposite direction, means there is a factor behind the scene that we don't see. But in this case, I believe that the main factor is that Pashinyan came to power, just like the color revolution in Ukraine, for the sake of reorienting Armenia towards the transatlantic camp, just like the color revolution and the Maidan in Ukraine. This is the same script adopted in different places in Eastern European countries or the former Soviet Union countries. And Pashinyan, in this case, he believes firmly that Armenia as a nation state, its history, its civilization, its religion as the first Christian nation on earth, Those are all irrelevant. He questions the Armenian genocide. He's fighting against the Armenian Church, Apostolic Church. He's fighting against the Armenian national identity. His popular base, they call the Armenian national identity fascism. They don't. They believe that the church has to be dismantled, and they believe that the country has to become part of the EU and bring in NATO forces. So I think this is the task. He's the executive director of the empire who is implementing this strategy there. He is not a national leader. He was selected, just like Jolani in Armenia, to lead this move, this shift. Pashinyan is ruling with 13% of popularity, according to the recent Armenian polls. He doesn't have a popular base in Armenia, but he's holding his grip on power because he has created an entire security and military apparatus loyal to him. He has completely kicked out all the former competent generals and security officials and appointed his people in these places. That's why Armenians have lost in Nagorno-Karabakh, right? And losing Nagorno-Karabakh was one of the tasks that he was tasked by these globalists, because they wanted to open this Zangezur corridor between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan and Turkey for the sake of the transatlantic camp to have this projection of power through Turkey on Central Asia and especially in the Southern Caucasus. Therefore, in this case, Pashinyan found himself naturally in the same camp of Turkey and Azerbaijan, who are the arch enemies of the Armenian people, and they would not hesitate for a moment to swallow the Armenian nation completely. And if there is anyone who thinks that nations do not die and civilizations do not die and do not demise, I have to remind them about the Assyrian Empire. I have to remind them now about the Syrian nation. I have to remind them about many civilizations which have demise because they made sometimes miscalculations or they were overwhelmed by wars during history. So the idea that Armenia cannot demise is a bollock idea. This will eventually lead to Armenia losing its sovereignty over southern Armenia, especially the Sunnic region, because they're going to lease it to the Americans for 100 years. And this will create tensions between Armenia and Iran. Iran has been a very good neighbor for Armenia for a long time. And Russia is the same thing. In 2016, when Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh, they had the same forces, they had the same strength, but they couldn't occupy Nagorno-Karabakh under the former president or prime minister back then, Serge Sarkisian, because he had a great relationship with all the powers, with Russia, with Iran, with the United States. That's the position of Armenia. It should have good relationship with both camps. It shouldn't be a pawn in this geopolitical conflict and become a weapon against any of the sides. If Armenia plays this dirty role in the region, as a small country the size of my finger, if you look it on the map, they would demise and they would be swallowed by these regional powers. That's the thing that I'm most worried about, because I'm ethnic Armenian and I'm trying also to raise an alarm about this case since 2018. But the same way many Syrian people were propagandized by the press, Armenians are the same thing. Glenn, there are millions and millions of dollars spent by these NGOs and this USAID and all these liberal organizations inside Armenia for media outlets, for the newspapers, etc. Kaya Kallas, the other day when she was in Yerevan, you remember what she said? She said, we want to spend, I don't know, $10 million or something on the independent Armenian media. The idea of bringing two words, independent and $10 million together, it doesn't match. How are you going to establish an independent press if you're funding them, which means they will follow the diktats and the editorial lines of the funders? And what is the interest of the EU in this case? It's the interest of opening this Nakhichevan. It's the interest of keeping the EU observers on the borders. It's the interest of kicking the Russian influence out of the Southern Caucasus and Armenia leaving the CSTO and joining the Western camp. I'm not against good relationship with the West. Don't become a pawn. The example of Ukraine as a huge country is in front of you. Armenia is the size of one city in Ukraine. So how are they going to manage their own security if, God forbid, a war erupts once again? And Azerbaijan continues saying, Aliyev, he says on a tape video that we see Armenia as Western Azerbaijan province. They're saying it. It's not like my analysis. Therefore, as a nation, if you want to protect yourself, first you need a national identity for the people to feel belonging to the nation. Second, you need to the religious aspect of it, especially that 97% of Armenians are Armenian Apostolic Orthodox people, and the belief in Christianity has kept the Armenians alive for centuries, especially after the Armenian genocide. So when you destroy the national identity and the church, you're destroying the two main pillars of the Armenian nationhood. So the Armenians have to do a reverse, a U-turn, to understand that their survival depends on this U-turn and going back to their national identity, to their church, and preserving their sovereignty. Because this Nagorno-Karabakh was not only a piece of land that the Armenians were like saying this is ours and there is a territorial dispute. No, it also kept the Armenia proper away from the Azerbaijani reach. This was like also buffer between them and Azerbaijan. Now that they lost this Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan is on the borders with Armenia. They have done incursions inside Armenian territories, and they're projecting their security and their dominance over Armenia. I think the national security of Armenia is completely exposed. And if Azerbaijan wants to roll into Armenia, they will not find a fierce resistance, unfortunately speaking. Therefore, what are they going to do? Are they going to call Justin Trudeau? Who's going to come and protect Armenia? The socks of Justin Trudeau or Kaja Kallas or the rest? No, nobody will blink an eye and come and send soldiers to protect Armenia. So Armenia has to stay in the CSTO and diversify its relationship with the East and the West and be in the middle. Don't become a pawn, not for EU, not for NATO, not for Russia, not for anyone. You're just an independent country in the region.
I think that's just such an important point, this need to diversify foreign partners, both for security, but possibly more important for economic ties as well. This is really the difference between being a partner of a powerful state or being a pawn. And I remember I always gave the same advice for Ukraine as well, which is, pre-2014, that is, you should diversify your economic ties. Again, you should reach out to the West, have more economic ties. You don't want to be excessively dependent on Russia, because if you're too dependent on one power, which is asymmetrical interdependence, in which you're more dependent on them than they are on you, you're not going to be able to enjoy any sovereignty, and you would become a quasi-colony almost. But at the same time, avoid excessive dependence on the West as well. And I think it's just common sense. Foreign powers, they prefer always a pawn over a partnership. And so with Ukraine, this was also damaging 2014, because then of course, you have to assess what the foreign power wants. Do they have benign intentions? No. I think Washington obviously sees Ukraine as the only strategic interest is a dagger against Russia. So the goal obviously is to have its sovereignty absorbed completely by Washington, to the extent it can be used. And that's why.
But Glenn, I believe becoming a pawn for the West is more dangerous than becoming a pawn for any other power, such as Russia or China. Because Russia and China, they believe in sovereignty. They believe in national states. But the collective West, they are living, or they're seeing the world from the post-sovereign lens. They believe in this creating a network of client states and not partners. The concept is different. And the West is very manipulative, let's say the Western officials. They keep talking about this, we're supporting democracy in Armenia. But when Pashinyan's forces beat the hell out of the protesters using the American-trained police against the demonstrators, we don't see condemnation from the West, which means this is a hypocrisy. The real purpose is geopolitics. And that's what bothers me, that you present people a beautiful dish, colorful with LGBTQ flags, and you're telling them, oh, we're going to save you, hold it. But it's like a poison. They're poisoning nations by just manipulating them into thinking that they are now free. Just like the Syrian people, many of whom went to the streets celebrating their freedom after the regime change, which is slavery, complete slavery. So the concepts have become the idea of what is freedom, what is democracy, and what is the sovereignty, what is this and that. Everything is upside down nowadays. You could be a slave and you go to the street and celebrate it thinking you're free, because that's how powerful the words and the media and this propaganda machine has become, that the people have become their own enemies nowadays. They don't understand that once you lose your country to such big powers and they destroy your army, they come and invest in your country. This means that you no longer have a national economy. If you don't have a national economy, you don't have a sovereignty, because you cannot make your own decisions any longer. And once these corporations come into your country, they're like worms. They spread all over the country and they suck your country dry. And what happened, for example, in Syria, like all these corporations taking over ports, the airports, the universities, the highways, the energy sectors, etc. Meanwhile, in the past, we had our own, like it's a Syrian companies, right? Which means Syrians used to work and generate this money for Syrians. But now Syrians will work as slaves for multinational corporations, and they will make the profits for these multinational corporations. The money is not going to be recycled in the Syrian national economy, but rather in the pockets of these investors, right? There is a huge difference between these two concepts. And I lean always to a country where people can make a decision which serves them. But if you become a slave country or a client country, then you lose the ability to make a decision making, even in your own curriculum, even in your basic daily life decision making, which is scary to think about, because we're going into a dystopian future where we have powerful elites not controlling over entire populations and manipulating them. And people are programmable, you know, they can change their minds and they can be persuaded and manipulated. And the evidence for it is, you said, the same script is working in different places, because although we have open books from Iraq and Libya and Somalia and Yugoslavia and Chechnya and Afghanistan and so many places for the people to just read, but it seems that they're finding a hard time to take the lessons. Even if they're reading it and the information now is free for everyone, some people are finding a hard time to take lessons from it. And that's why it is important for people like yourself and many other alternative people who are doing the work of what the media should do, basically, informing the people. Because on our TV outlets, we are not informed. They're telling us how to think about a conflict and what should be my decision. They're deciding for us. That's the main difference between explaining and telling. And therefore, these channels, in my opinion, really, they're doing a great job in informing the people. And you see how many people nowadays, Glenn, are pushing against it. But pushing now is no longer enough. Just talking is no longer enough. If the American people will continue voting for the same people over and over again, and this uniparty system in the US, which is built on generating profits from wars, these wars will not end. So we really have to urge Americans to make a change in the US itself. And that is why the American people are the most propagandized people on earth, because if they wake up, there is going to be a revolution in the US. And that's why the American elites have a strong grip over not only the traditional media, but also on the Silicon Valley and also the social media platforms, because they want to keep their people asleep. If they wake up and see what has this empire has done to the rest of the world, at least after World War II, it is going to create a change. Therefore, pushing alone is not enough, in my opinion. We have to be more active in convincing the American people to take an action inside their countries, and not recycling the same type of criminal mindset people into positions of power, because we are the ones paying for this price. Maybe American people there, they don't see what is happening in Syria. But in 2011, before Timber Sycamore, Syria was one of the safest countries in the region. We had over 7 million tourists in Syria. We had 4+% GDP growth in Syria. I used to be in Damascus and in other places. I see all these foreigners coming from the West for tourism in our country. What has happened now? It has become a Tora Bora. It's even worse than Afghanistan, right? So what has changed? It was the same regime. It was the same regime back then, but it was stable. What has changed is this regime change operation, this destabilization efforts, which was initiated by the CIA, by the MI6, by the secret intelligence apparatuses, for geopolitical reasons, for financial reasons, as we explained during this conversation with you.
It continues to surprise me, though, that people always fall for the propaganda, which is how you market the wars. Yes, effective marketing campaign. But and some people were saw it as a scandal when you had those CIA documents revealing in Afghanistan that they used the girls going to school as a way of selling an increasingly unpopular war to the Europeans. But it's strange to me that this becomes a scandal, that this wasn't obvious from day one, that so many people still think that the United States has a security strategy linked to hegemony, global primacy. This is how we will stay safe in the world. And yet, when it invades country, it sells this to the public as just pure altruism, just trying to help people. The idea that they would occupy, for example, Afghanistan for 20 years because they wanted Afghani girls to go to school, that this is what drives the policies. I mean, it becomes childish. But the fact that all the media repeats it is concerning. But also, I'm asking if in Armenia as well, I'm a bit surprised that the question should be asked: why is the US so interested in Armenia? What is it about its geography and position which makes it useful? Because this idea, they want to come and help us, that's why they're doing all these things. It's kind of strange. And I always made the same point with Syria. With Ukraine. You have all these American documents, these American scholars, think tankers, who written books, papers on why pulling Ukraine into NATO's orbit would be the pathway to breaking up and destroying Russia. And somehow, no, they're just coming here to help us. The policy is driven by desire to spread the democracy and freedom. It's very strange. So I just have a quick final question about Syria. Given now a lot of people were, for many had good reasons to be very critical of Assad's government, as you correctly said, is quite authoritarian. And a lot of there's legitimate humanitarian concerns, of course, about how he ran the country for a long time. But many people bought into this. That now the West is here. They just America wants to just spread the freedom and democracy alongside Saudi Arabia for some reason. And how are they seeing this now? Because for many people, they must surely, who backed the toppling of Assad and danced in the streets. I guess the wake-up call now is Giuliani and his henchmen running Syria to their detriment. And indeed, as you said, Syria itself will very likely fall apart. So is there any lessons learned, or how are people responding to this? I ask because I also see the same now in Ukraine. More people now are prominent, like former presidential candidates. Others are now saying, well, it looks as if the Europeans are just using us as cannon fodder to weaken Russia. I mean, this should have been evident back in 2014, but yet here we are. Do you see this in Syria as well?
Definitely. I'm seeing increasing number of not only Syrians, Lebanese, Egyptians, and Iraqis on social media platforms saying that in the days of Bashar, none of this has happened. What is going on now in Syria? Yes, when I said Assad was authoritarian, or he used to lead an authoritarian regime, this was a political authoritarianism. People were free on a social level, on an economic level. As long as you don't pose a serious threat to the regime itself, carrying out arms or forming an opposition party which wants to topple down the regime, nothing would have happened to you. But now under the Jolani regime, this is an example I want to give, which is very important. Like under Assad, you are an Alawite, you are a Shia, you are a Druze, you are a Sunni, doesn't matter. As long as you're loyal to the regime, nothing is going to happen to you. It wasn't a sectarian political regime. Now under Jolani, even if you were pro-Jolani, even if you were anti-Assad, even if you were a prominent opposition figure against Assad, if you are born into the wrong religion, you will get killed. And one of these examples this week I saw, this was really heartbreaking, which is a person who is a scientist, lives in a Syrian scientist from the Druze community. For 14 years, he exiled himself in Paris. He didn't want to visit Syria, which I am speculating because of the Assad dictatorship, right? He didn't want to come back to the country. Now, after the regime change, he wanted to visit his free and democratic country and enjoy it with his family. And he went to Sweden. And he got killed with his brother and with his father, documented on video. They have executed them in the street for being born in the wrong religion, which means some people have shot themselves in the leg. And his cousin posted a big post on X. I read it and it brought tears to my eyes. But when I went to his profile, it seems that they were long time oppositionists to Assad, which means they have celebrated this regime change operation. But once they went back to Syria, they were killed because of their religious affiliation. So this is the question that many people are asking nowadays, that have we helped the regressive sectarian revolution? The answer is yes. But many people, Glenn, they live in this self-denial. And it's difficult for many people to swallow the fact that they were on the wrong side. So they even double down, right? They don't want to accept that this was wrong, what has been done to Syria. But the people who are paying the price now on the ground in Syria, they're definitely regretting. And I'm talking to people in Syria. They're telling me, we no longer trust the shadow of our bodies. Like, we trust no one. We cannot even trust our neighbor. We cannot trust any person, our relatives. Everybody is suspicious of everyone, which means the trust among the Syrian people has gone. Now, even if the people regret it, even if they wanted to change the Jolani regime, who is going to replace him, right? That's the question. Even if somebody comes from, let's say, the opposition side, someone like Manaf Atlas, who was the son of the former defense minister of Syria, exiled in Saudi Arabia, and they have been preparing him for such a role for a long time. And this person is a military person. He's not a sectarian. He's not like a genocider like Jolani. But even if this person comes, this also means that he came from grooming in Saudi Arabia. And even if he comes, this means Syria no longer has a national economy, no longer has a functioning army. So he will not be able to build a sovereign state. And that's why I said the damage has already been done. And this could take decades. And probably the US and other powers would be distracted in other files in the world so that the Syrians could recover and build the state institutions again. But until then, this is going to take decades and very long time. So whoever comes next in Syria is not going to change anything except for the killing would stop against the minorities. But Syria as a country itself has already been destroyed. You know, you no longer have a you no longer have an access for the energy resources. So how can you build your country? You no longer have an access over your wheat. So how are you going to buy bread? And you lost your the factories are all destroyed. So who is going to rebuild the country? In any ways, whoever comes next, it's not going to. The only good thing that could come with a new leader is that the killing, the sectarian killing, could stop. But expecting someone to come with a magic stick in his hand that is going to rebuild the country. It's not going to happen. Logically, it's not possible any longer.
Yeah, and as you suggested before, a social contract can't just be reestablished. This is one of the things that needs time. So anyways, thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate it, and I feel a little bit wiser on the topic. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.